what should be described as a far-right reign of terror has descended over the country. Well, at least that's the experiences, the lived experiences of Muslims specifically and people of colour in general. If those of you are speaking, reaching out to your friends, people of colour, Muslims, right now, this is a hideous time. People scared to leave their homes, many not even feeling safe in their homes. It's difficult to describe what this even is. Elements of riot, terrorist insurgency, pogrom, gruesome stuff. Now, I've got the brilliant Asad Rehman, who's executive director of War and Want, to put this in context in terms of, we want to talk about the role of the political and the media establishment. I want a bit of kind of historical context and kind of where we go from here, I suppose, what happens next, how we fight them. So it's really great to see you, Asad. How you doing in these, well, what a question to ask. That's where we'll ask. And firstly, thank you for joining. But actually, I think that's a really important point, just to kind of flesh out. I think maybe a lot of white people in this country, however well-intentioned, don't quite understand what it's actually like at the moment for people of colour. So can you just tell kind of what's going on, WhatsApp group, family WhatsApp groups, that kind of thing? What's the kind of the sense, the feelings of millions of Brits, people of colour, Muslims at this moment?
I would say it's a very scary time. Obviously, people have seen homes being attacked, migrant hostels being firebombed. They've seen people pulled out of taxis and beaten up. They've seen the P word become used as like so much part of like back out there. Just casual racial insults. They feel there's been an emboldening of not just the far right, but of general popular racism. And of course, this isn't just the EDL and Tommy Robinson, and it's not just the fascists and far right, or the likes of Elon Musk and X and other social media platforms, which have for a long time been amplifying that division and hatred. It's also, I think, a feeling amongst the community, the Muslim community and migrant community, that they have a target on their back, and that target has been placed there by politicians and mainstream media, and we're now paying the consequences of it. You know, many decades ago, we was a slogan we used to have, that when politicians play the race card, we pay the price, often with blood on the streets. And I think that is very much the feeling amongst many parts of our community, that politicians have played the race card, we're paying the price, and that inevitably this will result in a loss of life. Obviously, widespread racist incidents already taking place. And because communities are more interconnected, whether through social media, WhatsApp groups, that trauma of this period is being experienced collectively. When people see those attacks, it's in everybody's living room. They're seeing it on their television screens. They're seeing it on their phones. And so it's become a collective and shared experience. And the fact that, you know, a large number of people who are in this country are having conversations about it's not safe to go out on the streets. Don't go here because we're going to be liable to be attacked. And my own nieces who live in Manchester, you know, on our family WhatsApp conversation yesterday, I was just sharing incidents of racist abuse and attacks that have happened in Manchester. And this is, you know, again, a big metropolitan city, very diverse, and they are, well, we're not going out today. I'm keeping my children in. We're not going out. We're not going to work. We're not doing anything. It's not safe for us. And that feeling, if it's not safe for us, is it's a terrifying feeling. And it brought me back to that moment back in the 70s and 80s where, you know, literally walking down the street, you know, made yourself a target for racist attacks. And we used to say, you know, our fight is for the right to be able to walk without fear of attack. And the fact that that is no longer a reality is shocking.
I mean, you grew up in Burnley, and in the 1970s, of course, we had the rise of the far-right National Front who terrorized communities, targeted particularly Asian Brits at the time. I mean, how does that, you went through, that had a huge impact, life-defining impact in your childhood. How does this compare? I mean, was it a sense of, without a sense of, obviously, you never had any complacency, but, it felt like that was a period which, although there was still clearly systemic racism, it wasn't that kind of constant presence of street level fears the 70s and 80s that had gone, and now that's come back. Is that what you kind of
Well,
part of what's happened?
Well, I don't think it's purely just been about the 70s and 80s. And of course, I grew up in Burnley during a time when the National Front were very, very strong. My parents' house, we were firebombed. We would be attacked at school, on the way to school. My parents were going into the town centre, etc. I mean, it was a very, very it was an experience that was a collective experience of all black and brown people, right? And it's what led to the whole development of black self-organizing, anti-racist movements, etc. But it wasn't just that there in the 1970s or 80s. I mean, I now live in East London, and we battled the British National Party throughout the 1990s and 2000s with their Rights for Whites campaign, with the racist murders and the racist attacks. Obviously, there were countless racist murders that were taking place. But I do think that people felt that the fascist threat had been pushed back. And I think there's a lesson here. It was a lesson that we very much articulated back in the 70s and 80s, which we said, you can defeat fascism, but without defeating racism. But defeat racism and we defeat fascism. And racism within British society and within Britain has not been an issue that we have adequately addressed. The structural roots of racism, the way racism is embodied within our political and media class. And of course, how over these last 10, 20 years, we've seen racism form and re-identify itself. So it's now generally acceptable to use the P word and the N word. But you want to be racist, there's a respectable form of racism. It's called Islamophobia. You want to be racist, you can be as racist as you want about migrants. You can say all the things that they used to say about us. We take their jobs, with their housing, etc., etc. Now you can say about migrants, and instead of politicians opposing that or the media challenging that, what you have is an amplifying of that, and politicians actually in a race to the bottom of who can be the most bigoted, who could say the most outrageous things about migrants, who can be tough on migrants. And we saw that, of course, in the last few weeks during the election campaign.
I mean, that's what I want to kind of delve into. Why now? Why do you think all of a sudden in the summer of 2024, we've now got a far-right insurgency, as things stand, almost exclusively in England? We've seen in Northern Ireland as well. There's a threat potentially in Scotland. We'll see what happens there. But I mean, what do you think has conspired to make this now?
So look, we know that this is a long time coming, right? The people who poured the targets, poured the oil on the fire, and are now, strangely all standing with their arms up, going, "I'm shocked at what the result." You could say these are the inevitable breeding ground of racism, fascism, of failed austerity policies, of low wages, of poverty, inequality, of gutted communities from deindustrialization, and all of those. You can say that those are the conditions in which we know racism and fascism always breeds. It bred like that in the 1930s, it bred like that in the 1970s, 80s, and it's breeding again now because of those failed economic policies, and I would say failed neoliberal economic policies. But what allows this spark to grow in a way that previous sparks haven't? Well, this is always a question of, like, I think for the far right as much as for others, they constantly try and light the matches and hoping that something will be able to trigger and allow them to amplify. I do think that the conditions were right for it because of what happened during the election. I think the fact that you have a Reform Party that was able to do what Margaret Thatcher did in the 1970s, which was to give a voice and respectability to anti-immigrant and racist views when she said people a right to feel concern about being swamped by people of an alien culture. She normalized that. And I think what we saw during the election campaign was a normalization of first of that in terms of migrant, of anti-migrant rhetoric. And I think the last 10 months of particularly politicians targeting the Muslim community, calling them, sectarian and hate-filled because they oppose the genocide that's taking place in Palestine. That normalized it. That made people feel way more comfortable that the enemy here is an enemy that is being directed and has been targeted and is acceptable to say these things. So I think it's really interesting, of course, that the argument is this is all about migration and migrants, etc. Yet you have children as young as 8 skipping through the street with their parents singing "kick the P words out," right? You have all the racist mobilizations directly targeting what mosques, directly saying, their rhetoric is all about the Muslims, and you know whether it was Boris Johnson with his, Muslim women look like letterboxes, all the way through to, former Home Secretaries talking about, Muslim communities hate-filled, or even Labour policy people talking about, shaking off the fleas when you talk about the Muslim community because of its concern about what was going on in Gaza. I think this has normalised a frame and a rhetoric which the far right have been able to exploit.
Yeah, I mean, a Mail on Sunday columnist, I won't name him, denouncing this, the horror on the streets. There's a study in 2019 which found that, well, media coverage of Muslims across the board was negative by a big margin. But the Mail on Sunday was the worst offender. 79% of all articles featuring Muslims were negative in slant. I guess it's just an example which you're kind of pointing to is just at the moment a lot of people going, oh, look at this, it's awful. There's not that much accountability about how we got there, whether it be the media elite, which has portrayed Muslims, British Muslims, as basically a kind of dangerous enemy within. And that fuses with a kind of stop the boats, anti-migrant, anti-refugee narrative. Because when Suella Braverman, for example, talks about an invasion on the South Coast, that's often interpreted as Muslim people and Muslim invaders. So it's kind of hostile, so it's just enemy within and enemy without, Muslim, hostile, violent, alien. But it's just, it seems quite Elon Musk, in Twitter, there's a focus and there's obviously a problem there. I'm not going to say that isn't a problem. It's quite convenient to just make that the exclusive focus, someone who lives abroad on social media rather than people who are the elite here and what they've been doing for years to incite and whip up bigotry and hatred.
I absolutely agree. Look, it's easy for people to say, isn't Tommy Robinson horrible? Don't we object to the English EDL? It's easy for people to also say, oh, look at how Wild West social media is. Elon Musk amplified this hatred. But they are not the root cause of this narrative and this view. And, and the media and politicians of all across the political spectrum have got to take ownership there. They set this on fire, they should own it because they have been more responsible for how both the Muslim and the migrant community have been depicted, framed, and talked about, and they have normalized and made that racism a respectable racism. And I think it's interesting also because it's not like we should be shocked at this, because this is the playbook of the far right across Europe and North America. Demonize migrants, attack the Muslim community, and also, go after trans communities, right? You create a heady mix and you say, this is who we are and they're the other. And once you start to other, you begin to like allow that frames of bigotry and hatred and fascism to just keep building and building and building. And of course, we saw it in the United States where the neo-Nazis started marching and we're seeing it here in the UK now with these racist and fascist gangs out on the street. But the idea that it can be resolved either simply by addressing those two, EDL and Elon Musk, or that there is a security or a policing response to it. Because often people are like, oh, well, if we arrest lots of people and put them through the court system, that will be the end of it. That's not the end of it. Of course, it won't be the end of it. That is not the answer. Of course, as a community, we want to be safe, but we also know that of like securitization and more police powers will be also used against the black and brown communities. I mean, the fact that the media and politicians talk about two-tier policing is just incredible. Two-tier policing when there's more stop and searches of young people of color, black and brown people, when stop oil protesters can be in prison for 5 years for being on a Zoom call. When people who took part in 2011 in response to the murder of Mark Duggan were being charged with riot and given long custodial sentences, and now we're seeing people charged with violent disorder. I don't think there is a carceral response in terms of this. This is a much bigger conversation. How is it that racism is as British as fish and chips? And why? And how is it woven into the fabric of our economic debate? And how do we actively become an anti-racist society, not just a society that tolerates other minorities now and then?
I mentioned obviously the Conservatives and their long history of Islamophobia. Saeed Abbasi, their most prominent Muslim politician, who's condemned them over and over again from Islamophobia from top to bottom. Polling of Tory members shows half of Tory members think Islam is a threat to the British way of life, whatever the hell that actually means in practice. And Boris Johnson, you mentioned. You could go on. It's just a cesspit of Islamophobia. I'm just going to read. This is from 2010, and this is a campaign in which they said in order to win, they had to convince Tory voters who were thinking of voting Lib Dem that if we can convince them they're being used by the Moslems, Moslems, it might help the candidate I'm about to say win. That they said that we need to go strong on the militant Muslim angle. We need to explain to the white community how the Asians will take him out. If we don't get the white vote angry, he's gone. And the campaign leaflet distributed by this candidate had written on it, they want you to vote Lib Dem to punish the candidate in question for being strong in immigration. The Lib Dems plan to give hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants the right to stay. It's up to you. Do you want the extremists to win? And then pictures of protesters, Muslim Islamists, the perpetrators behead those who insult Islam. I'm talking here about a Labour candidate. In fact, not just a Labour candidate, it's a Labour immigration minister. Phil Wallace in 2010, who had his election result overturned for lying about his opponent. And astonishingly, when his election was overturned, Labour MPs rebelled in support of him. They tried raising a campaign fund to get him back in the party. I'm just giving one example here. But, under Labour, we had the war on terror with all the way that Muslims were stigmatised, the clampdown on civil liberties, prevent. Batley and Spen under Keir Starmer, more recently, Muslims portrayed as anti-Semitic and homophobic, briefed against by Labour officials. The likes of Faiza Shaheen, who was booted out after and cited as part of the reasons to boot her out, talking about Islamophobia in the Labour Party. Labour Muslim Network have done polling of Muslim members and supporters even before Gaza, overwhelmingly thought there was a massive problem with Islamophobia and Keir Starmer was badly failing. And then, as you said, shaking off the floor. I could go on. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, it is obviously very important to take on conservative Islamophobia. It strikes me as quite dangerous for some commentators to make this out that that's exclusively a problem when we have a government and a particular faction of the Labour Party which has a lot of questions to answer, I would say.
That's why I said, I mean, across the political spectrum.
Exactly. Yeah, I wasn't saying that about you. Sorry, it's just certain. You're not doing that, as in commentators are doing that. That's what I was pointing to. Sorry.
Across the political spectrum, this is the respectable racism. Islamophobia is absolutely respectable. It passes the dinner party test. You can sit in a middle class restaurant or a dinner party in Islington with posh elites, and you can say these things about Muslims, and nobody will bat an eyelid. You can but use the word P word or the M word, and people would go, that's outrageous. So that's why I'm saying it's really interesting how racism has been reframed, morphed to be able to be respectable. And Islamophobia is a respectable, the most respectable form of racism, along with anti-migrant racism. Because people will say there are genuine concerns. We have like legitimate concerns about these communities. And of course, if your framing of these communities is in a particular way, that either they are, you know, backward, sectarian, anti-Semitic, terrorist, terrorist, blah, blah, blah. And that we've been doing for decade upon decade since the war on terror. Then, of course, that shapes public consciousness, and that shapes public discourse and what people think is normal and goes beyond without any question. I mean, you only need to listen to people phoning in on chat shows on any popular radio station, and it's quite incredible how they echo what politicians say, but obviously in a much cruder way. And you can make a direct link between, well, who says it, who amplifies it, who normalizes it, and then don't be shocked when it becomes part of the public discourse on the street.
Just finally then, where next? We've got mobilizations on the streets. How important are they? And, you know, as you say, there were those at the top, including Keir Starmer, who's kind of just going kind of Robocop, you know, judicial response. I'll say I'm surprised, even on a kind of centrist dad kind of way. I mean, you could see how a different sort of prime minister who is still a kind of centrist like him could do a kind of like down the barrel of a camera appeal for, you know, the sort of Britain that we've got to defend, you know, that kind of thing, you know, kind of a bit Hugh Grant in Love Actually-esque, without stress, you know, without kind of wishing something utopian that he's not given his politics, is what I mean. Doesn't seem to be much of that. It's just kind of, you know, lock him up, basically, without looking at the wide, making a political argument to the people of the country about taking on the far right, racism, fascism. That seems to be missing. So I'm just wondering what you think about in terms of mobilization and what you think of the kind of political response we need at the moment.
Well, I think many in our community were quite shocked and upset that it took the government so long to publicly come out and condemn. I think it was very noticeable that they were unable to use the word Islamophobia or anti-migrant racism. They talked a lot about thugs and etc. It was like very much in that frame. They couldn't name what the problem is, because of course naming it would also raise questions about their own roles within normalizing that. I think you're right. There are people in our community who are questioning, how is it that the Prime Minister hasn't visited these communities that have been under attack? Why isn't he going to migrant hostels and saying, this is Britain and we as British society stand with you, you have a right, making a positive argument as to why, you know, whether it's asylum seekers or migrants, we have been the bedrock of this country. We've built this country, right? Throughout generation after generation, providing cheap labor, you know, whether it was after the Second World War, but in the 60s and 70s, and again now, this is the people who are willing to do the lowest paid work to keep this economy ticking. There's an argument, you know, this is not, I mean, there's a positive argument to be made, but there's also an argument to be made, which is actually, you know, hey, the way our economy has been structured, you know, is a race to the bottom, and I'm committed to making sure that everybody will have housing. I'm committed to making sure that nobody lives in poverty. You can make all of those arguments. I think it's been about the Were they slow off the mark? Yes. Did they send the right signals? I think not, because they wouldn't talk about it. Of course, I think finally having the Prime Minister come out and at least say, you know, it was a law and order framing that they used, which, of course, reassured some parts of our community, at least, I think, after the first 2 days where they thought we're being left without any support from the state, that the state is abandoning us. That was like an important thing. But I think what really matters is now, what does the government do? And I think that is going to be a very, very big question. And I'm hoping that, of course, that they have a much more a willingness to look at what the root causes are and not simply deal with what the effects of racism within our society is. And look, at this moment, I think there are many people asking, what do I do? What should we be doing? And of course, solidarity is such a critical part. It's what binds our communities together. And that is really important, whether it's the vulnerable and communities out there, having solidarity with them. So, of course, turning up at vigils, doing all of these, I think is important, partly to reassure we are the many and the far right are the few. But what really matters is actually how are we organising against the far right? And I think there are some lessons to be learned going back through our decades about the importance that the labour movement plays within that. And that's also about recognising some of these people who are on the streets, who have been trying to murder other people of colour, are our colleagues at work, our neighbours, and unions must actively be anti-racist. And so they've got to take that fight, not just in the factory at the factory gate, but also inside the community. So it's not just simple, empty sort of we oppose fascism, but how do we actually go after the poison of racism within our communities? How do we rebuild solidarity? How do we find a way of connecting those often very deprived communities together? That's historically the labour movement has played a very, very positive role in doing. So I'm hoping that the labour movement will step up in terms of that and begin to do that. But the third, and I think we should all just be, mindful that what we saw over this weekend is just a small indicator of what is to come as these crises worsen and as politicians don't have an answer, as cost of living inequality deepens, as the climate crisis impacts people, as we're seeing more and more of this, the far right's argument of walls and fences and xenophobia and bigotry and hatred will continue to grow. And if we don't have the political policies to challenge them, but also to offer a different vision of hope that gives hope to communities and people, then we will lose people to the far right, just as we've seen happen in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and everywhere else. So we know what happened in those countries, and that's what we have to prevent here. And that is actually also a bigger question for our mainstream politics. You can no longer tinker around the edges of a failed economic and political system, which is leaving too many people in abject poverty, poor housing, and struggling to make ends meet. We have to answer both the economic question, but we also have to recognise this is also a race question. So it's having both a race and a class analysis and race and class solutions that is our hope going forward.
Amen to that. Nothing more toxic and dangerous than a broken economic system that produces mass insecurity and hardship and racism on an industrial and systemic scale. Very beautifully put by Asad, as ever. All huge amounts of wisdom. Please do share this. Make sure everybody hears Asad's voice. Press like, subscribe, leave comments. All of that helps the algorithm so more people listen. Very important, particularly on YouTube, which historically has been a place, let's just be brutally honest, where a lot of far-right radicalisation has taken place, which is why it's important we reclaim, and we have. The left's done much better at claiming YouTube as an online space, and it is important that we dominate increasingly these spaces where that form of radicalization, notwithstanding, of course, the role of the mainstream media and mainstream politicians. So do all of that. But as ever, thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Owen.